Most people think they understand what causes someone to leave. They imagine a dramatic argument, a slammed door, a final message filled with anger and accusations. They imagine a moment so obvious that nobody could miss it. But some departures don't happen that way. Some departures are silent. Some departures happen long before a person physically walks away. And if you've ever known a deeply empathetic person, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. The empath is often misunderstood because people mistake kindness for weakness, patience for unlimited tolerance, and understanding for endless forgiveness. They assume that because the empath keeps listening, keeps helping, keeps giving chances, there must be no limit. But every human being has a limit. Every heart has a threshold. Every soul has a point where it realizes that continuing to stay is more painful than leaving. The dangerous mistake people make is believing that an empath will announce that limit when they reach it. They usually don't. They give signals. They give opportunities. They give more chances than most people would ever offer. They explain. They communicate. They try to understand both sides. They search for solutions. They look for ways to repair what others are willing to abandon. And because they do all these things, people become comfortable. They become convinced that the empath will always be there. They begin treating loyalty as something guaranteed rather than something earned. That is where the process begins, not the process of leaving, the process of losing them. Because the empath notices everything. They notice the small dismissals that everyone else ignores. They notice when their effort is expected but never appreciated. They notice when their words are heard but not valued. They notice when they are only contacted during moments of need. They notice when respect becomes conditional. They notice when honesty is punished. They notice when their kindness becomes a resource that others consume without ever replenishing. And here's what many people fail to understand. Empaths do not immediately react to these things. They study them. They observe them. They give people the benefit of the doubt. They assume there may be explanations they cannot see. They believe circumstances can change. They believe people can grow. They believe mistakes can be corrected. That belief is both their greatest strength and the very thing that often keeps them in unhealthy situations far longer than they should remain. The outside world sees patience. The empath feels disappointment accumulating one experience at a time. Imagine a glass filling with drops of water. No single drop causes the overflow. No single drop creates the flood. Yet every drop matters. Every moment of disrespect matters. Every broken promise matters. Every act of selfishness matters. Every time someone takes without giving matters. The empath may not confront each incident individually. They may not create conflict. They may not demand attention. But the memory remains. The lesson remains. The pattern remains. Parallels are everything because empaths don't evaluate people based on isolated events. They evaluate patterns. They ask themselves difficult questions. Is this person consistently honest? Is this relationship balanced? Is my presence appreciated or merely expected? Am I valued for who I am or only for what I provide? Does this person care about my well-being as much as I care about theirs? The answers to those questions slowly shape their decisions, and that is why the final departure often surprises everyone except the empath. By the time other people notice something is wrong, the empath has already spent months, sometimes years, processing the reality. They have already fought internal battles nobody saw. They have already replayed conversations. They have already questioned themselves. They have already searched for reasons to stay. They have already carried emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. The silence before an empath leaves is not indifference. It is evaluation, it is reflection, it is acceptance. Many people assume that the absence of complaints means the absence of problems. Nothing could be further from the truth. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is carrying the loudest realization. Sometimes the person who appears calm has already reached a conclusion they no longer feel the need to debate. When an empath begins withdrawing emotionally, the change is subtle. They stop explaining themselves as often. They stop trying to convince people to understand. They stop chasing conversations that lead nowhere. They stop investing energy where there is no reciprocity. The effort that once flowed naturally begins to slow. Not because they have become cold, but because they have become aware. Awareness changes everything. Once an empath recognizes that their compassion is being exploited rather than appreciated, something shifts inside them. Once they realize that loyalty is being mistaken for dependency, something changes. Once they understand that giving more will not create the respect that should have existed from the beginning, they begin conserving their energy. And energy is the most valuable resource they possess. People often talk about time as the greatest currency, but time alone means nothing without emotional investment. An empath doesn't simply spend time on people. They spend attention. They spend care. They spend understanding. They spend emotional presence. They offer a level of connection that many people spend their entire lives searching for. The tragedy is that some people only recognize that value after it disappears, only after the calls stop, only after the messages become rare, only after the emotional support is gone, only after the empath quietly walks away. Then comes confusion, then comes regret, then comes the desperate attempt to understand what happened. But by then, the departure was never sudden. It only appeared sudden to those who were not paying attention. The empath was paying attention the entire time. They noticed who listened. They noticed who cared. They noticed who reciprocated. They noticed who only appeared when they needed something. And eventually, they made a decision, not out of anger, not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. Clarity is powerful because it removes illusion. It removes false hope. It removes the stories we tell ourselves to justify situations that are hurting us. Once clarity arrives, staying becomes harder than leaving. The empath finally sees reality without the filters of obligation, guilt, or wishful thinking. And when that happens, their exit becomes remarkably quiet. There is no campaign against you. There is no dramatic announcement. There is no need for validation. There is simply absence. The conversations disappear. The emotional access disappears. The constant support disappears. The availability disappears. And with it goes something many people never realized they depended upon until it was gone. Presence. A genuine empath offers presence in a world filled with distraction. They offer understanding in a world filled with judgment. They offer patience in a world obsessed with instant reactions. But when those gifts are repeatedly taken for granted, the empath eventually learns one of the most important lessons of their life. Not everyone deserves unlimited access. Not everyone deserves unlimited chances. Not everyone deserves unlimited understanding. Boundaries are not cruelty. Boundaries are wisdom. The moment an empath learns that lesson, everything changes. They stop proving their worth. They stop chasing approval. They stop carrying responsibilities that belong to others. They stop sacrificing their peace to maintain relationships built on imbalance. And perhaps the most surprising part is that they often become happier afterward. Not because leaving was easy, because staying had become impossible. The quiet disappearance of an empath is rarely an impulsive decision. It is the final chapter of a story that has been unfolding for a very long time. It is the result of accumulated evidence. It is the result of repeated observations. It is the result of realizing that love without respect eventually becomes exhaustion, and loyalty without reciprocity eventually becomes self-abandonment. So if there is one lesson to remember, it is this. Never mistake patience for permanence. Never assume that someone who understands your flaws will tolerate endless disregard. Never believe that a person who forgives often cannot eventually walk away. The strongest departures are not always loud. The most permanent goodbyes are not always spoken. Sometimes the people who cared the most leave the quietest. And when they do, it is not because they suddenly stopped caring. It is because they finally started caring about themselves enough to leave. The moment most people finally notice the change, they make a critical mistake. They focus on the departure instead of the process that created it. They look at the ending and ignore the thousands of moments that led there. They ask why the empath became distant. They ask why the empath stopped reaching out. They ask why the warmth disappeared. But they rarely ask a more important question. What happened so consistently that a person known for their compassion decided silence was the better option? That question is uncomfortable because it forces accountability. Accountability is difficult for people who have grown accustomed to receiving without giving. It is difficult for those who became comfortable with one-sided effort. It is difficult for anyone who assumed that emotional labor would always be provided free of charge. An empath often becomes the emotional anchor in relationships. They are the person everyone turns to during chaos. They are the person who listens when others need to vent. They are the person who remembers details, notices changes, and offers support without being asked. They become the safe place. They become the stabilizing force. And that creates an invisible danger. The more reliable they are, the more people begin treating that reliability as normal. Think about that for a moment. The very qualities that make an empath valuable often become the qualities that others stop appreciating. What was once admired becomes expected. What was once respected becomes assumed. What was once seen as generosity becomes viewed as obligation. The empath notices this shift long before anyone else does. At first, they ignore it. Then they question it. Then they try to correct it. Then they become exhausted by it because no relationship survives indefinitely on one person's effort. No friendship remains healthy when only one side initiates contact. No partnership remains balanced when only one side makes sacrifices. No connection remains strong when only one side carries the emotional weight. The empath understands this better than most because they feel imbalanced deeply. They can sense when something is off even before they can fully explain it. They notice changes in tone, patterns in behavior, inconsistencies in words and actions. They observe things that others overlook. People often underestimate how much an empath sees. They assume kindness equals blindness. It does not. In many cases, kindness exists because of awareness, not because of ignorance. The empath sees the flaws. They see the contradictions. They see the selfish behavior. They see the excuses. They simply choose understanding over immediate judgment. That choice, however, should never be mistaken for unlimited tolerance. There comes a point where understanding no longer changes the outcome. You can understand why someone behaves poorly and still decide not to tolerate it. You can understand someone's pain and still refuse to become its permanent target. You can understand someone's struggles and still recognize that their struggles do not justify how they treat you. This realization changes everything. Because once an empath separates understanding from obligation, their perspective becomes incredibly clear. They stop asking how much more they can give. They start asking how much they have already given. They stop asking how to save the relationship. They start asking whether the relationship is worth saving. That shift is powerful. It transforms the entire dynamic. For years, the empath may have been focused on fixing problems, restoring harmony, and preserving connections. Now they begin evaluating reality. They begin measuring effort. They begin noticing facts instead of promises. And facts have a way of cutting through illusion. Promises speak about the future. Facts reveal the present. An empath can survive disappointment. They can survive mistakes. They can survive misunderstandings. What becomes difficult to survive is a repeated pattern that never changes. A repeated pattern tells a story. A broken promise once may be an accident. A broken promise 10 times is information. A selfish action once may be a mistake. A selfish action repeated consistently is a pattern, and patterns are what eventually convince an empath to leave. Not because they want to, because they can no longer deny what they see. Many people assume that empaths operate primarily from emotion. That assumption misses something important. Healthy empaths are often highly observant. Their decisions may involve emotion, but those decisions are usually supported by extensive evidence gathered over time. By the time they finally withdraw, they have already reviewed the situation countless times in their minds. They have considered alternative explanations. They have questioned their own perceptions. They have searched for reasons to stay. They have hoped for improvement. They have waited and waited and waited. Eventually, waiting becomes its own answer. One of the hardest truths an empath learns is that potential is not reality. People fall in love with potential. They stay loyal to potential. They make excuses because of potential. They tolerate behavior because of potential. But potential is simply possibility. Reality is what consistently exists. The empath may spend years believing in who someone could become. They may continue investing energy into future versions of people who never actually arrive. They may convince themselves that one more conversation, one more chance, one more sacrifice will finally create the change they have been hoping to see. Then one day they recognize a painful truth. The person they keep waiting for does not exist. Only the person standing in front of them exists. And that realization breaks the spell. The fantasy dissolves. The excuses lose their power. The hope that once justified everything suddenly feels empty. This is often the exact moment when outsiders become confused. Because externally, nothing dramatic has happened. There was no explosive argument, no public conflict, no catastrophic betrayal. Yet internally, everything has changed. The empath has crossed a psychological threshold. They no longer need proof. They already have enough. The evidence has accumulated. The pattern has become undeniable. The decision has quietly formed. And once that decision forms, something remarkable happens. The empath stops fighting reality. For years, they may have been wrestling with facts, trying to reshape them into something more hopeful. They may have been searching for hidden meanings, overlooked possibilities, and reasons to remain invested. Now they simply accept what is acceptance creates peace, not immediate happiness, not immediate relief. Peace because clarity removes confusion. The empath no longer spends sleepless nights wondering where they stand. They no longer analyze every conversation. They no longer search for hidden explanations. They know, and knowing changes everything. This is why their departure can appear so calm. People expect pain to create chaos, but sometimes pain creates certainty. Sometimes the deepest wounds produce the clearest decisions. The empath is not calm because they feel nothing. They are calm because they have finally stopped arguing with reality. That calmness often shocks people. Those who ignored concerns for years suddenly become alarmed by silence. Those who dismissed feelings suddenly become interested in discussing them. Those who offered little effort suddenly become desperate to demonstrate effort. And sometimes those changes are sincere, but timing matters. Because every relationship has a window during which change can still alter the outcome. When concerns are ignored repeatedly, that window begins to close. When respect is consistently absent, that window narrows further. When appreciation arrives only after withdrawal begins, it often arrives too late. Not because forgiveness is impossible, because trust has already been depleted. Trust is a resource. Every broken commitment withdraws from it. Every act of disrespect withdraws from it. Every disappointment withdraws from it.